She'll come. But I have a very short time with you today. It's even less than the previous panel, so I want to use every minute because we realized the chat all of a sudden, it was like 20 questions. So we want to get to as many of them as possible. So my name is Bonnie Ling. I'm a professional collector of questions, as you saw yesterday and today. And it's a tremendous honor to be here today. I'm a child immigrant to this country. And I couldn't help but, as I'm here in New York, and I was thinking the other day, the poem that's associated with the Statue of Liberty, give me your hungry, give me, what is it? Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free. And I just thought maybe she was writing about human rights due diligence, about maritime, right? Work in maritime, because the poem instinctively kind of focus on the misery of that life at sea, but also at the same time, the rest of the poem talk about this dream, of something better. And I think maritime sector for a lot of the seafarers who work is that double-edged reality. So without further ado, I'm joined today by a very distinguished panel. And I hope in a conversation with them, we can draw out some of these points following from panel one. And then we go in briefly into ports, and then we zoom back out again into transport and logistics. So all that in 55 minutes. So let me introduce my panelists. We have Martha calling in from Germany. Hi, Martha. So Martha Selvin, she is the UN Global Compact Ocean Manager. She also leads the Just Transition Maritime Task Force, working with IMO, ILO, on these very important issues. We have Christopher Saunders calling in from Singapore. Hi, that doesn't look like nighttime in Singapore. But it's very nice to see you. Christopher is here today as the Chief Product Officer for RightShip. There was a very long question on RightShip in the chat, so you can take that question straight away. RightShip provides due diligence service on all the issues we talked about previously in the first panel. And he will talk us through some of the tools that they have developed on human rights due diligence in this area. And then we have Doug Nystrom. He is the Associate Director for North America for Impact. And I don't feel like I need to introduce you because I think you know a lot of people in this room in your previous capacity as working with Walmart to push for the responsible recruitment agenda. So it is absolutely an honor to have this panel, and let's start straight away. I would like to start, we're in the post-COVID world, right? But I think, Martha, for your presentation, for your remarks, I think it's important that we go back to the times of COVID, right? And so you can talk to us about what was the crew change crisis? What were the circumstances that drove the UN Global Compact in collaboration with the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, the IMO, to look at producing some type of guidance to help us deal with the unprecedented challenges. So Martha, if I could just give you the floor for the next 10 minutes and we can do a quick Q&A back and forth. Thank you, yes, Martha.
Certainly. Well, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And of course, my apologies, I can't be with you in person. If it's a bit bright here, it's because I'm currently in London and not Germany, where it's very hot. So great to see you all. So yes, great question, and let's start from the perspective of COVID. And I think, as with many sectors and industries, COVID shone a light on a number of things that weren't going well in our societies, and I think in this case, it's no different. So just to recap what was happening during the pandemic, as we're all very aware, as it affected all of us in some way, shape or form, there are a number of travel bans, government-imposed travel bans, and of course this had a huge impact on seafarers, who of course are often from different nationalities and having to travel from different ports to one another. And at the sort of high point of the crew change crisis, around up to 300,000 seafarers were actually impacted. And by that I mean couldn't get off the ship, but also couldn't get on the ship as well. So this was really sort of negatively impacting their sort of basic human and labour rights. And as Mark already mentioned in our sort of first panel, was also infringing on aspects of the Maritime Labor Convention, including, for instance, being deprived of your annual leave, but also other kinds of sort of fatigue, physical and mental health issues, and of course, critically, working beyond the terms agreed in their employment agreements. I think some seafarers were even on board for 17 months. And of course, under the Maritime Labor Convention, it should be around 11 months. So really, lots of infringements happening in that respect. Now, we know, of course, as I already mentioned, that, a lot of these travel bans, et cetera, were coming from government. So they were really being, led from that kind of, political perspective. And of course, as we know, under the UN Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights, it is ultimately down to governments who have the core responsibility to protect human rights, and they should have done more, and we know that. However, of course, companies, businesses across the supply chain under our UN Guiding Principles also have, the responsibility to respect human rights. And what we were increasingly seeing at UN Global Compact, but also more generally in the ecosystem, was that not only were governments not upholding their responsibilities with respect to letting seafarers on and off board, but a number of charterers and cargo owners were increasingly exerting pressure along the supply chain across the other direction, and essentially saying that they didn't want crew changes because crew changes took an additional 2 weeks. And of course, they're driven by sort of time constraints. And they were actually exerting pressure on the shipping community not to undertake these routine crew changes. So at that moment, we really, recognized that there was a real need to undertake some kind of business advocacy and education to ensure that that kind of additional pressure from the supply chain wasn't already exacerbating a humanitarian crisis. So that is basically the backdrop to our UN Global Compact and Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is what we call our call to business action, which we launched, and essentially called on companies across the global supply chain to conduct human rights due diligence in this, instance of crisis, and of course to utilize their leverage on governments and other maritime transport providers. But interestingly, as the UN, we love a call to action and a joint statement. But one of the sort of feedbacks that we got from a number of companies was, well, how do we do that? How do I conduct human rights due diligence? Like, what does this actually look like? And we really realized that there was very little awareness, if at all, across, really large companies, cargo owners, who one would have thought would have this on their radar. So we realized that that kind of call to action wasn't enough. And we actually had to kind of get into the nitty gritty of what the practical actions would actually be, both for a charterer and a cargo owner, to actually undertake human rights due diligence in this specific instance. So that was kind of how our human rights due diligence tool was born, that you already sort of made reference to. And it really does try and outline practical actions that cargo owners and charterers can take, both from, and Francesca already mentioned this, and the great case of TGF Brands, how they then went out and liaised with their transport partners, sought written assurances from their suppliers that their expectations with respect to seafarers' rights were being upheld, of course, liaising with the International Transport Workers Federation. So what we try to do in this tool, and perhaps I'll have a moment to talk a little bit more about it in another round, is really try, and I think it was the first sort of go at this, to outline practically what cargo owners and charterers needed to do in this situation. And as said, I think the kind of key takeaway as such from that was it just was not on the radar of so many companies before. And of course, as we know, shipping and of course the wider transport logistics network is an integral part of every company's supply chain. And of course, under the UN Guiding Principles, you have a responsibility to workers along that supply chain. So COVID really shone a light on that. And I think, with incoming legislation and things that we'll go on to talk about, I'm sure in another round, this is only going to get more heightened.
Well, thank you so much for that brief overview, Martha. I would urge everyone to read the guidance because it is very well written. And moreover, I was really struck, and my colleague, Francesca, mentioned this as well. it is backed by a very well-written case study on why TGF got involved in looking at crew change, right? So you spoke of there's very low awareness, but there was a case study of a brand who was very honest, very open about how they were starting with zero. They didn't know the issue, but they felt upon hearing all these stories of they call it humanitarian disaster in the making, a lot of mental suffering on the seafarers who were stranded and couldn't get off the vessels, that they wanted to do something. So they started with zero. They were quite honest about where they started. So can I ask you, how do we get more companies to embark on this journey, knowing that the starting point is zero, but that is okay. That is where we're from.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. And as always, there are a number of sort of push and pull factors. So, of course, we have to start in some respect with legislation. And I'm sure, as many in the room are more aware than probably I am in some respects, there is, of course, an increasing rise in sort of supply chain due diligence legislation coming out of Europe, coming out of the US, coming out of other parts of the world. Of course, in Europe, you have another challenge, sort of more of a patchwork approach to different kinds of legislations. But with the new EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, nice short word there, of course, there will be extended requirements under EU law to look at your broader value chain. And of course, that does include shipping and that does include logistics. So there'll certainly be more impetus from that kind of legislative angle to actually undertake some of these sort of human rights due diligence processes that are so needed. And of course, as Mark mentioned, on that other side, of course, accelerated by legislation, there is an increasing demand from financial actors and the sort of broader community to undertake better ESG practices. And of course, this kind of human rights due diligence within supply chains falls within that radar. And I'm not going to in any way contradict Mark. I think what he said is true, but we do know what the S is to an extent, and it's human rights due diligence. We know how to handle it. We know what the processes are. We know how to undertake a risk assessment. So yes, of course, what the S is will depend, but we do have the measures and the processes in place, and we shouldn't use that as an excuse not to do anything about the S. And I think, as I said, there is increasing focus on this. And as I said, we do have the tools to enable us to do that. So, as always, it will be a combination of, legislation, but also, actors wanting to do better with respect to their ESG practices, also to support gaining new kinds of finances, like sustainable finance, and all these kinds of things. And I think one thing I'll just end on that respect, Ben, here to support what Mark mentioned about, what we see in other sectors is that leaders in sustainability, we want to go beyond compliance, right? Compliance is like the baseline. And, we're now looking at what do I do in addition to what I should do? And I think we need to think about that in the context of the Maritime Labor Convention because, yes, that is the baseline, that's the minimum standard, but actually what should we be doing beyond that and what should leaders in sustainability in the S be doing to increase and add on to what is only really a minimum standard?
Thank you, Martha. So I have one more minute. So I want to just quickly add the question of what else is out there besides the UN Global Compact guidance on human rights due diligence for maritime? Are you aware of to help companies who are embarking on this aspect of their human rights due diligence process?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, of course, I'm sure Francesca has mentioned this throughout, but Institute for Human Rights in Business and the Sustainable Shipping Initiative have their code of conduct. And of course, their whole network, who I would say have added, fantastically to the baseline, which really was just a COVID-related human rights due diligence tool. So that really is, as I see it, the thing to help as things stand. Of course, we know, and this is, mentioned, throughout the discussion, that kind of collaboration in multi-stakeholder coalitions and working groups really is so helpful and important because, we are all learning. And I think we'll be learning even more so with respect to, being able to uphold some of these new requirements that are coming for many companies. So engaging, I have to plug the UN Global Compact, of course, in our peer learning groups on decent work. These are all things that will really help, to move the needle. And one thing I would also add is, I'm really impressed, and I'm not just saying this because Mark's here, with the work of the International Transport Workers Federation in this, in this field. When you now look at the next stage of TGF brand's journey, they've actually now partnered with the ITF, and they are now actually engaging in an MOU whereby the ITF is doing, basically a due diligence assessment across their entire logistics chain and obtaining verifiable data for the company to make sure that they are mitigating and responding to any risks. So that is a really, we know that unions and workers are one of the most important stakeholders when it comes to human rights due diligence. So to see that leadership and almost activist position and opportunity to partner and collaborate with the ITF to actually gain the data that you need, I think is really, really reassuring. And they're also looking at this with respect to road transport and, of course, all the other sectors that they cover. So partnering, using active stakeholders, and, of course, engaging in multi-stakeholder coalitions are where I would recommend starting.
Wow, great. So you set up the scene really well for our next panelists. Thank you so much, Martha. So Christoph, you're calling in from Singapore. And I think you can speak about this collaboration that Martha talked about. You've been working with IHRB and on this assessment code of conduct going above what's listed in the Maritime Labor Convention. So over to you.
Good evening from Singapore, and thank you for having me join. I think, lots of great work going on in this space. I think, Francesca, there were some slides we were going to run through. I'm not sure if they're available for the audience there at the moment or not. They're not here at the moment. But essentially what we were going to run through was a little bit about one of those collaborations. So the work we've done with SSI and IHRB around that code of conduct on seafarers' rights. But I was going to start maybe recognizing that a lot of the audience is sort of new to maritime, just sort of introducing RightShip and the work we do. So as we're the world's leading third-party maritime due diligence organization. We were actually set up by BHP, Rio Tinto, and Cargill to manage the due diligence requirements of themselves. And we've been going sort of 22 years in that space. What's, I think, really interesting with RightShip is the people within the organization. So we've probably got enough ex-seafarers working within the business to crew 2 or 3 container vessels, for example. I'm an ex-mariner myself, so we bring that sort of domain expertise and knowledge and understanding of what's really going on board the vessels. And we couple that with the sort of data and the information that some of the panelists earlier in the session talked about. So there's a wealth of information out there in terms of port state control data, information on incidents that take place in the industry that can lead and give you information around crew well-being, factors that can be a trigger in that. Also physical inspections of the vessels themselves, and there's many parties doing these, and we conduct our own across vessels. And again, that gives you a really good opportunity where you're seeing firsthand the conditions on board the vessel. So we bring that all together in terms of a digital platform where that sort of insight and intelligence can be leveraged. Francesca, I think we can move on to the next slide. So we're just going to sort of introduce that sort of collaborative work we did with SSI, and that was around the code of conduct and the self-assessment tool itself. And I think really that links into what Mark introduced around the Maritime Labor Convention and the fact that it's really a minimum standard. And the working group we had, we really looked at this and looked at what more can be done in the space for crew welfare and crew well-being. And with that, we looked to sort of craft out a sort of best practice guide, essentially, for ship owners and operators to refer to in terms of those next steps they wanted to take to improve the livelihood of the crew they were employing. And that looks across a range of areas, but it allows them to sort of make a gap analysis and to then look at ways to continually improve year on year. And increasingly now we're 1.5 years into that initiative. the data that then presents to us, I think, is now becoming increasingly valuable to charterers and cargo owners and brands in terms of giving that insight in terms of those vessels and companies that you may be doing business with. So if we go on to the next slide, we've got a few just very high-level stats in terms of the data that we've collected so far and the companies that have contributed. So on the left of the slide there, we've got the sort of the key areas which I think will resonate with everyone today, and particularly the fair terms of employment. So that very much looks at the recruitment policies, forced labor, the payment of fees, but also goes beyond that in terms of basic, intermediate, and advanced levels of best practice in this space. In terms of submissions, we've seen really good traction across the industry in this first year and a half. We've got 270 sort of document of compliance holders for the vessels. So these are the owners and operators that really have influence in terms of the safety and crew welfare standards on board those vessels. So that's representing nearly 7,000 vessels, and then we sort of estimate that probably is a coverage at around 250,000 seafarers when you take into account crew changes and rotation on board those vessels. So I think really great progress. And I think what's important to highlight at this stage is that this is all from owners and operators wanting to take that step to improve the standards on board the vessels. This is a voluntary self-assessment to look at their current practices and to use the tool as ways to improve. And of course, if we leverage what Ben spoke about in terms of the power of cargo owners and charterers to really start to increase the pressure on owners and operators, I think we can see contributions to initiatives like this and many others picking up because there really is that power in the hand of the cargo owner. And we've seen that, certainly from RightShip side in other areas in terms of safety and sustainability, that putting in place in terms of charter parties' requirements, it is very effective and it does drive change in the industry. Francesco, I think we can move on this next slide. We just talk about a little bit in terms of how RightShip can help and I guess around sort of increasing transparency of this. So we're really excited to be launching a free tool where any company can register, sign up, and have access in the coming month. In terms of any vessel or company in the world, you can search them. You can look at the crew welfare status in terms of whether they have completed the self-assessment or not, but also other key information that talks to sort of human rights standards. So whether there are any cases of abandonments of seafarers, which again, the earlier panel touched on. I think since 2001, over 10,000 seafarers have been abandoned. Of course, thankfully, this is relatively rare events and it's on the tail end of the shipping, but I think it just highlights the risks that are out there. And, it's really critical that you know who you're dealing with. You've got that insight, intelligence to be making the right decisions and understanding, your risks and managing that. So there's a QR code there. I think we've shared it as well. So please, do make use of that. We want to share that insight and information, make that available, be as transparent as possible in terms of those who are contributing. And start your journey in terms of filling in some of those knowledge gaps in terms of the information that sits out there. But thank you. I'll hand over, Bonnie. I'm sure you've got some follow-up questions.
I do. I have more questions for you. So you speak of how thank you, Christopher, for that. So I have three things. So let's see how far we get in the next 5 minutes. So you speak about making it free, right, to ship owners to use. But how do you, even with it being free, how do you encourage more to use it, to self-assess? And then and I also want to give you a hard one. verification. I think in some ways it shares similarities with the global compacts where the companies produced a report that is put up on the web and it talks about their adherence to the 10 principles, but it's not checked, it's no oversight. So let's start with there. How do we get more people to use it and who verifies?
Yes, absolutely. So I think it's been remarkable, I think, in terms of the work and the coverage that's been achieved so far. And as I say, that's really down to proactive submissions. Of course, there's been leverage. I think there's some really good examples in terms of some of the big charterers really buying into this initiative, and some were part of the working group in terms of forming it up. So that has certainly helped, and I think we'll, as Mark and Ben touched on, I think that we'll only continue to see a larger adoption of these sorts of best practices and initiatives. It's the pressure from that sort of demand side. We're seeing big charterers building it into their sort of human rights declarations. I think one of our shareholders very publicly has put that forward amongst many other initiatives in terms of what they're doing. And I think we're seeing partnerships in terms of people pairing up with companies that are doing the right thing and rewarding that. And I think that ultimately is the key here. There has to be that recognition and reward to encourage more to be doing the right thing and going beyond that minimum standard. And from RightShip's side, that's certainly where we see this. Making that visible and available within the platform against a vessel or a company. We really want to be able to reward those that are doing the right thing and are going the extra mile. Of course, the self-assessment is just the starting point, as you correctly say, Bonnie. There's got to be that governance around it. There's got to be that verification if we're truly going to use this and trust it completely. There's a lot of work going on in that space, and very much so. I think, again, the demand has to be there from the charterers, from the cargo owners, that's something that they want, they require, and we need to have that being written into contracts that there's a demand that they the people that you're using, the companies, the vessels that you're utilizing, that they are signing up to initiatives like this and they are becoming verified in terms of their declarations. From RightShip's side, we're performing verifications through physical inspections on board vessels and also through physical audits going to the management company's offices and working through their submission, looking at their practices, but also in terms of working with organizations like Turtle and others that, understanding who they're working with, what ship managers, what ship owners are utilizing their services. And again, that gives you an assurance that the right measures are being taken in areas such as recruitment. So I think there's a lot of work going on in this space, but there's an awful lot more that can be done and needs to be done. But it's exciting to see it progressing.
Thank you for that, Christopher. And I see that I have 1 minute, so I want to squeeze this in. So what about the role of workers' voice? What do you do with that in terms of planning ahead for the next stage? What's coming? Do you engage with unions at ports? Do you, what is the role they play in what you spoke about for verification and transparency? That would be my last question, then we move to Doug.
Sure, yeah. No, so we've got an exciting piece of work underway at the moment, again with the same working group that sort of formed the self-assessment and the code of conduct in the first place. And we'll be reaching out through that working group to other industry players as well to contribute. And that's very much focused in revising the crew welfare standard and the content that's within it, leveraging the learnings that have been now that we're a year and a half in, taking feedback, understanding again where MLC, for example, has had revisions, where we've seen charterers, cargo owners making further requests and demands. And introducing that sort of governance process in terms of a verification standard. And again, that will be published out to the market. And then making that sort of verified or unverified data, again, freely available so that all stakeholders in the industry can start to make use of that. Of course, that's in a collaborative way. I think the likes of ITF, ICS, many others are involved in the process. And you know, for it to really be successful, it thrives on that sort of level of involvement.
Well, thank you very much for that, Christopher. I hope in the Q&A we can come back and pick up on some of the threads. But now, in the interest of time, let's move on to our last panelist. And I was teasing Doug earlier before the panel. I said, I'm going to throw it to him, and he's going to tell us how to fix it, you know, in his 10 minutes. But okay, so I was only half joking because I would like for us to end up somewhere in that direction towards the end of our discussion. But let me just ask you, from your long experience of working on human rights issues in supply chain, do you think there has been sufficient attention given to the shipping sector?
No. We can end it right there.
Okay, all right.
No. First of all, I feel like I'm a short person amongst giants here because of my experience in this area. Makes me feel like my extent has been paddling around a kayak amidst all these big ships. But I would say no. There hasn't been enough attention on it. And I think that IHRB and these organizations putting a spotlight on it is really helpful. But it also causes some angst, for businesses. I think, if you think about how businesses have approached supply chains and responsibility in supply chains, they started with tier 1, tier 2, what they buy, what's manufactured, what's sold them. Now they're being told they got to go to tier 3. Raw materials, you got to do it. So you're going down that train of thought. And then you got to throw in, we got these recruiters over here that we got to start monitoring just in that product supply chain, which that's another element of complexity. Now you're like, we got to look at all the shipping now.
Yeah, and let's talk about value chain, right?
And I'm going to say that's a whole nother discussion internally because that's a different department within companies. That's your logistics, your transport. It's not the same contracts. And so I think there has to be discussions internally. I'm trying to jump to solutions, I guess, quickly, but as I think it through, companies need to have your human rights people talking to the logistics people now. Your lawyers for the logistics are going to be different from the lawyers that were for your compliance or for your corporate affairs or whatever it is. So you're going to have to involve different lawyers now. And I think that because those contracts with freight are different than your master service agreements with suppliers. And so you're going to have to embed these standards, and the standards for suppliers you might have aren't necessarily going to be in those freight contracts. And so I think you've got to start with embedding it in those. So sorry, I'm jumping to the solutions. I'm just trying to help you think through why this hasn't been focused on, I think, yet, because it's an aspect of the supply chain that is very different from what companies have been focusing on.
No, I think it's a valid point, and I think it reflects the general observation that logistics and transport team, typically in a company, are not usually there on a discussion, on human rights due diligence. Right. So why is that, and how do we bring them into this important discussion? Because this is where all these issues that Christopher mentioned, that Martha mentioned on human rights due diligence, that's where we can start looking at risks in transportation.
I think it's just the way companies are. You've got to segment and specialize. The specialists are over here for transport and logistics. Your buyers and merchants are over here. So it's just the way it is. So you've got to have a matrixed approach to this within an organization. And it's not, they've not necessarily been part of the equation when it comes to human rights. So they're going to have to get educated. They're going to have to be brought up to speed where everybody else in the company might be on the same page. And I think that's where highlighting it, like IHRB does, allows those people to have those conversations internally. And I think if you can have more stories of what somebody has gone through, like Ben could supply, that gives information that you can take back into your company and to say this is what's going on. And then I think, if you're trying to do this internally, you got to start looking at risk. Where is the risk? You can't tackle everything. So as a company, okay, let's kind of map out the risk here. Which lines, which freight companies are more risky? Does it depend on where the flag state is? These flags of convenience seem, in my mind as a lawyer, seem to go like, okay, if I want to skirt the system, I might go to, let's pick a country that I think is is not very restrictive, and I'm going to go with that as a ship. And so something's got to be done around there. So I mean, this is a whole ball of wax. I think this is huge.
Yes, a whole ball of wax.
And I think it's going to take the spotlight. It's going to take business. Whether you've chartered or cargo owner or importer, it's going to take that as demand we've heard. I think is important. It's going to take those actual owners of the ships doing it. And then I think there's a whole public policy piece to this that has to be done, advocacy, and how do you advocate in Panama when you've got, okay, that might be where the flag state is, but you've got a bunch of people from the Philippines, so you're going to have to advocate for changes in Panama, perhaps, be more restrictive, or maybe they need more resources, or either ports need resources, and then you're going to have to advocate for maybe policy changes within the Philippines. You got to be more restrictive of the manning in the manpower part of it.
I'm kind of smiling a bit because panel 1 opened with this short introduction about how complicated it is. We're looking at flag state, we're looking at port state, and then not to mention all these jurisdiction issues. Law of the sea typically is not an easy law class, for these reasons where you have different overlapping jurisdictions, you have nationality of the seafarers, you have a ship that can be divided and bought up by different people, you can have ports that are divided and different people own it. So it is complicated. So I think that is a barrier, to a lot of people trying to understand the maritime sector, how complicated it is. And I think you mentioned very, very rightfully so, the regulation, right? Internationally, nationally, it is a very mixed picture. I mean, I am astounded by the fact that UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, if you look at slavery, they prohibit the transportation of slavery. So the question is, okay, so is the use okay?
Right.
So I think the people tend to feature very weakly in a lot of these international discourses on ocean governance, and we need to change that because we see the effect of that trickling down to the national level. So you spoke of the power of stories, and I think going back to what Martha said about the due diligence briefing produced by the Global Compact, it was that. The case study they used was, it started with the company hearing about the tremendous the unfolding humanitarian disaster for crew that was stranded, and they wanted to take action, and they fed that to the board, and there we're seeing all that ripple effects, that Martha spoke about. So I think that is indeed very, very powerful. So let's move the discussion a little bit to your idea of solutions. So where do we start? You alluded to groups like this, where we, multi-stakeholder initiatives. Is contract an option? Should these clauses be inserted into contracts like Christopher suggested?
Yeah, I think so. I think if you want to protect yourself as a company, you better put some of these in there. As you have a freight contract, especially if you're going to charter vessels, which was popular during COVID because of the supply chain issues. You're a step closer to the conduct, and you're a little more. You're always responsible, but you're a little closer to that responsibility. And so if you didn't have something in there in a contract, you're very exposed, if you didn't. And so, that's the first step in the OECD due diligence is embed it in your management systems, get it in the contracts, and that's what everybody has done. Companies have done with standards for suppliers. They put those in the contracts. Well, these are different contracts now, and we've got to make sure that the same type of thing, the code of conduct that we've been talking about, is probably in those as well.
Okay, so contracts,
Yeah.
that's one thing. more awareness around the stories of the negative impacts, human rights impacts, the high recruitment fees that we looked at in panel 1. Let's look at some of the other solutions. What about ports? What can port authorities do? They're the linchpin. You know, if we look at maritime transport and transport on land, should we ask more of port authorities? What are their due diligence procedures? I can say that I actually looked up the Freeport documents that the UK government is proposing just to see what were their provisions on human rights, and I don't think I found any, you know? So how do we change this whole ecosystem where, again, the people do not feature in issues of governance in these talks of trade?
Yeah, Ben mentioned earlier about inspection and monitoring being filling those holes in the ports and getting that done. You know, and it really might be that there's a lack of resources. You know, I don't really know in the ports, and so it may be that there needs to be some input of extra resources, whether it's you know, another country, USAID helping kind of, for example, or DFID helping to actually build up the resources of those ports. I mean, that may be a solution to that.
I see our online panelists nodding. Can I ask you for some of your thoughts? Martha, do you want to jump in?
Yeah. Sorry, I was nodding. No, I mean, I was nodding and thinking because, I mean, ports, sorry to bring more complexity into it, but of course ports are also incredibly complex. You have public ports, you have private ports, so their kind of entry points into action will be quite different. With respect to privately owned ports, of course, that same kind of logic with respect to rising ESG, all these kind of things may apply to them, and we see ports already having certain sort of measures in place for ships visiting ports with respect to their GHG emissions or green credentials. So one could assume that something similar might be done with respect to human labour rights. But once again, with a publicly owned port, they will also, in some ways, have more responsibility to actually do something about this. So once again, it is complex, and the entry point and the leverage that each port will have will be very different compared. You know, some are also privately owned, for instance, as well. So I think that's also something to navigate. But as I said, each of those actors will then have different reasons for taking action on this, and a number of them are with respect to environment. So there should be no reason why this cannot be included.
So be mindful of the complexities and look at building up capacity for port authorities, you know, and going back to Martha's point about, you know, knowing that these are complex settings, but we need to identify our points of leverage. Christoph, you were nodding, so can we have your thoughts and then we move to the floor?
I mean, I think we've seen firsthand, you know, we work with ports and terminals as well, and I think the challenge in that space, as Martha alluded to, is obviously for charterers, there's that kind of go-no-go decision making option in terms of the contracts. Often with the ports, you're receiving a vessel. Of course, if there's grave concerns there, then there's options in terms of rejecting the vessels or detaining them or excluding them. But often, you know, you don't know so much around the vessel until it gets in, and that harm or that problem is already within your port. So I think the role of the ports, terminals, that sort of space is really around reporting when issues are detected. I think we leverage a sort of feedback reporting mechanism with the ports and terminals that use our platform. And it's a really, really valuable tool. They're on board the vessels. They're able to flag, you know, where there are welfare concerns. They're often even inspecting the vessels. Now, that can be port state control inspections, which are obviously official, but there can be more informal inspections being done just at, you know, the terminal operators, the loading masters, the pilot even boarding the vessel to help safely navigate the vessel in. These are all touch points where you know, we've got to sink into that and be able to capture data from that to then be able to take action and to be able to, you know, stamp down on the offenders and ultimately stop them being able to trade. I think that's the key here, is about I talked about earlier about recognizing those who are going beyond the minimum standards and rewarding that. I think at the same time, those that are found to be guilty, those of it to be found to breaching basic human rights and those minimum standards, we've got to restrict them in terms of being able to do that harm again.
Thank you so much, Christopher. So many interesting points. You speak of, inspections, penalties. Shall we take questions and see where the discussions go? I'm just very mindful of time because the next panel is on child labor in the US, and I don't want to steal any minute from that. All right, Francesca.
Right, yeah, so I don't know, is this microphone on?
No.
It's my first time. Bonnie's the pro here. So a couple of comments, questions just coming in about fishing vessels, and as I mentioned in the first panel, unfortunately, we'd love to touch on the issue of responsible recruitment there, but we don't have the time for that today. So I guess 3 questions, one of which you've sort of answered, and I'll just ask all 3, and then you can tackle them. But in terms of enforcement and inspections, should brands be paying for inspections more? What more can be done around inspections? Should there be more advocating to get that more off the ground? In terms of the self-assessment, does it pick up on the most sensitive issues for seafarers? And then rounding back again to just look at the issues of responsible recruitment, are there any cases of sending governments taking responsibility around seafarers who've either due diligence in terms of remedy or in terms of preventing it happening in the first place? And I guess that reminds me also of the question that I didn't come to in the first panel that you mentioned, Bonnie, about positive examples of shipping companies addressing the issues of recruitment fees in their staff.
Wow. Thank you so much. I think the most obvious is, Christoph, you take the question on self-assessment. We spoke a little bit about enforcement and inspection, but I wonder whether or not, Martha, you can take that. And then we go back to responsible recruitment and Doug. Yeah, how does that sound? And then we'll wrap up promptly. Okay, Christoph, your turn. Self-assessment. Does that pick up the most sensitive issues?
Yeah, I think the question was around, does it pick up, yes, the most sensitive issues? So I think, yes, it does. It's been constructed certainly with quite a breadth in terms of what it looks to cover. So everything from those recruitment practices that we spoke about and I've heard an awful lot about, well-being on board, provisions of access to Wi-Fi, the quality and quantity of food, recreation equipment, payment of wages, support in terms of mental health, healthcare. I think all those sort of key items that Mark spoke really well about in terms of what you would expect in any shore-based job, which sometimes is not actually provided on board vessel. So I think absolutely it does. However, it's not in isolation. I think there's plenty of work going on in the industry. There's lots of innovation. There's lots of tools that contribute to doing even more. And the self-assessment is about highlighting some of those and promoting them and making suggestions that, in best practice. For example, engaging directly with the seafarers that you're employing to pulse check how they're feeling, to check in on their mental health, to provide them more support in what is often a challenging job where you're away from your family, and we heard about some of those stresses and challenges. So I think no tool or solution is there in isolation. There's many initiatives, the ITF doing a lot of work as well, and I think they're all fantastic and have a role to play.
Thank you very much. So Martha, you work for the UN Global Compact, so tell us, how can we improve enforcement and the actual implementation of the MLC?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, even though, yes, UN Global Compact, we work with companies, but I'm going to chuck it a bit back to our member state friends here, because we know that the ultimate enforcement of the Maritime Labor Convention does rest with governments to some extent. And here, of course, during COVID, we saw that a lot of what they were supposed to be enforcing, they didn't. So I think, there's lots of lessons to be learned there to how we can ensure that governments and authorities actually enforce what they've signed up to under the Maritime Labour Convention. And I know there are a lot of lessons to be learned in that respect from COVID. I see Mark nodding. I don't know if you can all see it, but I can. So there's a lot to learn there. But maybe just, moving also away from the role of authorities to enforce the MLC, I think, there's another role for legislation here, which is, as I mentioned, there's obviously now this increased scrutiny on sort of supply chain due diligence, risk assessment, and we know that under the incoming legislation in the European Union, for instance, that there will be a need for companies to verify what it is they're saying that they're doing. And that, of course, is another mechanism of enforcing what companies say they're doing in that respect. So I think, once again, using those kind of legislative pull factors will be important. And then, it's already been mentioned by Chris, but of course, when it comes to the verification aspect, the ITF is doing, great work in that respect, being able to actually inspect the vessels. But of course, in order to be inspected, you need to have that collective bargaining agreement in the first place. So a way to enforce is also to engage through collective bargaining, to engage with the unions. And that will be, another, one of the most important ways to ensure that what you are expecting of your suppliers is actually coming into fruition.
Thank you, Martha. So I think we return back to a standard question when it comes to responsible recruitment, which is how can we get states to drive the solutions and actually implement the responsible recruitment model, not just for seafarers, but across, and make it the standard. So Doug, how do we do that?
How do we get states,
2 minutes.
The countries?
Yes, exactly, sending
yeah.
states, but I think it's equal, right? All states.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And this is what the Leadership Group for Responsible Recruitment's been fighting for a while. How do you get these governments to actually change and actually have a responsible recruitment mindset, regulating the manpower agencies that are sending the workers out, protecting them. It's going to take multiple engagements. It's going to take brands and businesses coming together and saying this is the way it should be. It's going to take these vessel owners. It's going to take organizations like we've had today kind of coming together, and it's going to have to be a collective effort to try to pick and choose. Okay, I think let's pick the ones that are kind of the worst actors here, and let's go engage them. I think that's the key. But it can't just be one company or one entity going to talk to them. And then it's got to be other governments kind of putting pressure as well through things, and through their aid development or through trade status, things like that.
Yes, so.
It's not a quick solution. Sorry.
Yeah, where's that checklist, Doug?
Yeah.
Very true. So we have 1 minute, and I feel like we're just starting, right? We can talk for another hour, I think. But, and we should keep talking, right? That's the message here for the group. We're just at the beginning of the journey for human rights due diligence in shipping. But the greater goal is to change it to a system where responsible recruitment is the norm. It's not exceptional, it's just the way it is. So let's bring that into reality. So in the last minute, I would like to ask you to join me in thanking our panelists and also for the participants calling in online. I know a lot of people from Asia are calling in. They were very excited about the shipping day focused. So thank you so much.